Okay, so we're going to talk about the importance of honoring people's pronouns. And I guess my first question is, um, first of all, I guess, why is it important that, some people would say, what's the big deal? He, him, she, I mean, I've always called people this, or I've always, referred to a woman as, in this way. Why is this important that people get their pronouns honored and respected?
Yeah. Kevin, thanks for having me. I think, as we get started, I think what's important is that as a clinician, which I am, right, it's important that I honor that client and I honor who they bring forward. And for me to make an assumption, it dishonors the client, and therefore there's a breakdown in our relationship when we think about the therapist client relationship. And so already as a clinician, I'm working behind. I'm already trying to catch back up, either to gain trust, to gain appreciation for uh, the relationship that could be, that can be built. And by gendering somebody other than what they want to use for themselves is taking in assumptions, taking in assumptions that we know how it is to walk in their shoes, which is a big mistake in basic counseling. In basic counseling, our goal is to try and empathize, to be in service with our clients, and to allow them to give us a roadmap, a compass, but a way to help them navigate the world through their eyes. And the best way that we can do that, and that's one of them. And when I jump on most Zoom meetings, I just noticed today mine's not changed, but mostly when I'm presenting or if I'm teaching classes, I do use the he, him, his pronouns. And that allows also for many of the students I might be teaching, or clients that I'm meeting for the first time, or trainees, that I am paying attention, I am cued in, I am alert and acknowledge that it's important that I model what it looks like.
Mhm.
Um, and in various, I think in various trainings and workshops and things like that, people inevitably always ask, how come you have that? Or why are we going through this process? And it's to honor folks. It's to honor people that are in the room and actually have them be seen and acknowledged rather than being invisible.
And those are great points. I mean, it also reminds me of how people define themselves, like maybe, based on race, based on religion. So if somebody, for instance, is Black, and I refer to them as Chinese, I mean, that's kind of an extreme. But could you imagine the discomfort and anger even that somebody would feel if they're being, you're assuming what their race is or what their religion is. If you're
Right.
Catholic and I say you're Buddhist, or I make assumptions, which which can very often happen in our multicultural society, is that sometimes I look at people and I go, well, I know they're not white, but they could be Indian, they could be Filipino, they could be part Black and part
Right.
Chinese. I don't know. But people's self-identity, I think, is so important, and it's not a matter of necessarily understanding why it's not such a big deal, or it is a big deal.
Uh-huh.
What kind of harmful effects can happen? I mean, you mentioned it a little bit to the clients if
Yeah.
if somebody is not respecting that. And the second part of the question is, what advice would you give to somebody who's feeling a little bit awkward? Because sometimes in today's PC culture, people are getting like paralyzed. Like, I don't know what to call people. I don't know what to say.
Right.
What would you say to them?
That's a great question and leeway into the flip side, right? Like if we turn it on its head, and what I tell the students that I teach is I actually want you to make mistakes. And as a clinician, with as much power and privilege we have in session, for us to be able to acknowledge that we made a mistake and note that and allow the person to see that is great modeling. It's also great modeling for relationships, right? So, if I'm feeling awkward, I don't know how to show up in space with an individual, or they catch me off guard, um, or I just feel like, oh my gosh, there's so many rules. How do I show up in the world right now? I always tell people, err on the mistaking, and let me correct you. Give me that opportunity to let you know who I'm bringing forward, who you're in the room with. And when we start to assume or make assumptions, I mean, it just takes us down that dead end and down a rabbit hole that we very seldomly do get back. And it's really hard to recover, especially if it's a first session or a first meetup. And that first impression is lasting. And that's why it's so harmful, because we remember that. And, Kevin, I was watching a video actually, just to prep for this, and this video was talking about how uh, uh, microaggressions, or when people misgender, it's like getting a mosquito bite. And so these people, these individuals who are getting mosquito bites, it's happening more and more and more. And it's because people who are well intended are making these comments, but they're doing it over and over again and they're not paying attention. And, I think what I would say to your second question is for folks to really just pause, hit the pause button, speak with intention, because our intention has consequences. And the consequences, unfortunately, aren't up to us for perception. It's for the individual who's receiving the comment or the insult.
Yeah, I mean, very good points. And what I was thinking is, it's just that I think sometimes people get overwhelmed by
Mhm.
so many terms, and they keep like adding letters now, the LBGYTQQ, and
Huh?
I what I will do is go back and kind of get updates, because I want to be diligent about trying to stay as current as I can. So that leads me to my next question
Huh?
is, are there resources, are there glossaries of terms? Sometimes I've run across these, here's a list of, I don't know,
Yeah.
25 different ways to describe people based on gender or whatever. Are there resources out there like that?
Yeah. There's a really good website actually I like to use called, it's pronounced metrosexual. Is it yeah, it's metrosexual. And it does a really good job, and it's really tailored closely to Glisten, to the Trevor Project, and others, safe space organizations, and Safe Zone, that really come up with awesome curriculum, so that educators, administrators, clinicians like myself can refer to. And you're right, to be diligent about our work, to be diligent not just because we're in a professional setting, but to be diligent because it matters. I have to think that a lot of the things that have happened in 2020 and 2021 is because our fellow person isn't being diligent enough. They're not educating themselves enough, right? And so we've got to be our own co-conspirator and really inform ourselves of what's new. And as somebody who identifies as a gay male, um, not take that for granted, and to acknowledge that there are still areas in which that I need to work on, and to be mindful of that, and to be intentional and go into that space and not be afraid to. And I think fear really plays into the what should I say versus I'm gonna just try it and go for it, because people really do not like discomfort. If they did, we'd all have therapists.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I was thinking as you were saying that was that I think when people get uncomfortable, they want to run away or avoid the situation that's making them uncomfortable. So sometimes they will be dismissive,
Uh-huh.
like, what's the big deal,
Uh-huh.
Joshua?
Hmm.
Um, or they use really kind of snarky, sarcastic humor, and they can actually mock people. Because I've seen this on Facebook a lot, and especially with, like, recently some of the appointees that President Biden have made,
Hmm.
and people are making little just sarcastic, kind of passive aggressive kinds of comments. And I'm thinking these people are uncomfortable and fearful
Uh-huh.
of something. Otherwise, if you're not fearful and uncomfortable, why do you have to say anything?
Right. Right. And yeah, I mean, I think when people go into fear, a few things happen, right? One, when we go into fear, we're able to acknowledge that we're ready for that discomfort. We actually want to be in that. And in the same light, when when we believe that we're running from fear, we're actually in fear also. But we're choosing to move that fear in a different direction or lead in a different direction. And, I have to say, hats off for folks who are wanting to sit in the discomfort and to educate, to learn, to inform themselves. And for those folks who aren't quite ready yet, ask yourself, what is keeping me from moving into that fear and going into that way of being different or changing my thoughts, my ideas, what I learned and knew growing up, and how can I continue to stay in this place?
Yeah, and the other thing I was thinking about is what I tell people is there's a ripple effect as well when, even like with parents and their
Huh?
children, if children are watching you
Yes.
at all the different ages, and if you are making jokes and you're, mocking people and somebody says to you, hey, would you please refer to me this way, and you're not sensitive or respectful, then the kids will think very often, well, that's okay, and then you see it play out on the schoolyard. I don't know how many times that, and I'm sure you've seen it, growing up as a kid. I mean, bullying and mocking people that aren't like, you know, somebody's not like me. So instead of just say, hey, that's cool, whatever,
Right.
it's like I have to go out of my way to to put them down or something.
Right.
Because again, I think like you said, living in fear, I'm in some type of fear mode.
Yeah. And it's really interesting, the modeling effect, because I just saw something on CNN today about a mom in South Carolina who was really following the QAnon group and really involved and in it. And one of the and it wasn't even her story necessarily that caught my eye. What caught my eye was her daughter. Her daughter in the article said something like, "I didn't think I was ever going to get my mommy back." That's lasting. And so what we're doing is at early ages, we are imprinting, like you're saying, these messages that this is okay. These are okay ways to be. And children, I mean, they are so malleable, impressionable, and in ways of being, we are teaching them that this is how you show up. This is how you show up to the world, and this is how you treat people. um, versus I think what you were mentioning, actually, no, this is how we should show up. And this is how we should speak to one another that is respectful, that respects how this individual wants to be talked to, which pronouns they want to use. I think it's very much close in line, like you were saying, in terms of race. Like, Joshua, where are you from? And I'm like, well, I'm from Arizona. They're like, but no, like, where were you before that? And I'm like, well, yeah, I lived in Tucson, but then I moved to a small town. And they're like, but before that. And I'm like, are you talking about my historic lineage, my legacy, my what are you asking me? And and that is one that it comes up all the time. What is your language that you speak, or are you fluent? And I say, yes, I'm speaking to you now. um, and so I think it just it aligns with. And but when I read that article and that little girl, I thought, wow, that's some major trauma early on, that your parent might have left you for something that was not real, that proved to this
Oh,
woman that it wasn't.
for another reality, and the paranoia that just permeates that
Right.
whole movement. I mean, we've talked earlier in an earlier conversation about racialized trauma or
Huh?
trauma that you just carry with you, and
Right.
impressions of certain types of people
Huh?
as an adult can stem from how they were stereotyped when you were a child by your parents in a lot of cases, or by your relatives. Like, don't go near those people because those
Right.
people are bad, for very,
Yep.
which segues nicely into just a conversation here briefly about microaggressions.
Right.
And for our audience again, well, what's Joshua's definition of what is a microaggression?
My first response is like, oh, when my stomach starts to turn because somebody made a comment they didn't mean to. I mean, in essence, that's it, right? But it's a comment or an action that I think is that negatively targets marginalized groups, right? And historically marginalized groups or people, communities, like you were just mentioning, right? Like, uh, I, growing up, and I ask this question all the time in my classes, counseling classes in particular. Growing up, how many times did you hear, "Hey, make sure your door is locked," and they happen to be driving through a neighborhood that may not have been as well groomed or that they felt safe in. Um, and they're based on bias, they're based on assumptions, and they're based on stereotypes. And when these comments are made, even though they're not meant to be harmful, they're not intended to be harmful, the outcome, the consequence is really harmful because it's my perception and my experience. And I think that's the real takeaway, that's the real ride home, is that even though somebody says something like, "Wow, you're so well spoken, Joshua," I think to myself, okay, if I hear that one more time, how many letters am I going to have to continue to add to my last name for them to get, like, understand what you're doing to me? And it's this ripple effect, right? It's like those mosquitoes. These groups of people are constantly getting bit or stung over and over again. And so eventually, right, we lose it. And and it builds. And so these microaggressions are not just a one-time event. Because if they just happened once, we'd be able to say, "Oh, shoot, fly, that's all right." But it doesn't happen just once. It happens over and over again. And we talked about a few of them. Another one is like, "You don't look Jewish," or "Where are you from, really? Do your parents have their papers?" And especially in this past year, right, our immigrant and refugee communities really feeling it when people were discriminating against businesses and folks who might not have looked like they belonged. And I'm like, belonged where? Like, this is borrowed land too. And so, we have to pay attention to those comments. And even if it was something that was said when we were growing up and it was welcomed and people laughed at, probably not okay now. And I think what's important to acknowledge also about microaggressions is they can be unintentional and intentional, and the intentional ones are spooky. Intentional ones, there are swastikas posted places, and comments like "whites only belong here," or if you're not from America, then you should find somewhere else to live. And and it's interesting as I'm talking about it, I'm even noticing my voice drop because it means that much, and it still affects and brings up a lot in me still.
Well, I think what you're talking about too reminds me of the effects, and you just touched on it, the visceral, emotional, mental kind of burden or effect that it can have on a person of color. Because uh, I had an incident once several years ago where I do radio programs, and I've done like talk shows that are very formal, and I've done a Saturday night blues show.
Yeah.
Okay, which it has a I have a different demeanor doing that show than I would. I'm not doing a lecture. I'm doing the blues, man. Right.
Right.
So somebody who knew me in one context, it was like I was this different person on the radio. Wow, he sounded so different. I said,
Yeah.
I'm the same person. But when I'm with that particular white person, I'm code switching,
Yes.
because I'm not being phony, but I'm also aware that there's a this person and I do not have the same background. Therefore, I have to kind of, I don't know, temper my behavior somewhat, or adjust or adapt. And I think that that causes an extra amount of an extra weight, I think, on a person who, and a lot of people of color have to travel into these from one context. They go to work all day, then they go home. I
Yes.
was in Montana recently. I didn't see a black person for 3 days.
Right. Right. Right.
So I had a different kind of mentality when I was in Montana than if I was on Capitol Hill.
Right.
And what kind of effect does that have on people?
Well, you're seeing it in the living, right? Like, I mean, and as we're sharing, like, it's one thing because we're colleagues. We have this lived experience and this wisdom that we've gained along the way to even understand, oh wait, that's right, that's what I'm doing. I'm not changing my whole self. I'm style flexing or I'm code switching based on what parameters, policies, rails I need to stay in to keep me safe, right? And eventually, you're right, it does. It continues to build on us. I remember when I started grad school and was learning around, every psychologist, every white psychologist that I needed to learn about because they were the founding people in counseling, right? And I was just like, why am I feeling this way? Like, why am I feeling like this is just so not like speaking to me? Well, yeah, because they didn't look like me. And they didn't speak like me. And it, this visceral, this somatic movement in my body was the movement of, like you mentioned earlier, this transgenerational trauma that we carry with, you know? Tell my old trauma that. You can't tell my old trauma that, right? That today's going to be different because my ancestors' experience was much different than mine is. And I appreciate you talking about that and bringing up this like layered effect. Because even code switching is difficult on us.
Mhm.
And the more we do it, we do have to sit back and ask ourselves, whoa, who am I today? Like, and oftentimes I do that. And when I teach my client, my students, excuse me, in class about counseling and reflecting after session, that is the number one thing we need to do. Take a minute for yourself, recollect, figure out who you are, who's your next client, and how do you want to show up.
Well, and what you were saying about clients, for clinicians that'll be watching this and counselors and therapists,
Yeah.
what you said I think is so valuable because I think it gives insight to the clinician or the counselor who a client of color walks in and they can know that this person might be code switching in the session.
Yeah.
No, and it's not like they're hiding something or not being authentic, but at the same time, you have this, white counselor just out of, just got her MSW or whatever from
Right.
University of Iowa, sitting here
Uh-huh.
with this, as I heard recently, a 60-year-old black man who was angry because he felt like he was being profiled. And she's
Uh,
like taking notes. So tell me, Mr. Jones,
yeah.
well, the insight that you provided today, I think gives somebody more to think about, like what this client might be processing while he's talking to you.
Right.
Yeah, looking through his eyes or her eyes. Yeah.
And yes, 100%. And I mean, out of the park, right? Like, I mean, we as clinicians have to think that way. My 43 years of experience are sure they're going to inform how I show up. And they're going to bring all of those experiences in with me as the sage I should be. And so, what I would say to clinicians, either starting out, middle of the row, or, our seasoned folks, right? Like to really stop and think, like, who is in front of me and what do they bring in? I just a short little story here. I was working with a student just today, actually, and one of the things they said to me was, Josh, what's so difficult about this class and about these exercises is I feel like I'm having to be fake in these role plays. And I listened and I listened, and my client, male of color, said, I am 43 years old now, and who I was for those 43 years is really having to learn how to be different today. And I said, that is the most beautiful thing you could ever admit to yourself, acknowledge, and I also want you to bring all those 43 years in with you because that is going to make you the clinician that you are today. And we forget that. We forget that our experience outside of the classroom, the office, etc., has really set us up with some really good tools. And so all of these things that we're talking about tonight, the gendering and racial microaggressions and trauma, like we have all had experience with it. And it would be innocent and naive of us to say that we haven't.
Very well put. Any final thoughts about what we've been talking about, or pieces of advice that you want to leave the listener or the viewer with?
Yeah, one of the most beautiful experiences that I've had with clients in particular is to be able to understand and ride that essence. And when we're in session and you feel the essence and the connection between your client and self, it is just so wonderful. It's like, I don't know, it's like when you feel that that life has just paused, like snowflakes when it's snowing, and you're running, and it is so quiet that it is that awesome. And we get to be that way in session, and we should also be that way outside of session.
All right.